In 2026, ECOWAS committed to launching the ECO, a single currency for West Africa, by 2027. It was a promise the region had heard before. Deadlines set in 2000, 2005, 2009, 2015, and 2020 had all passed without a single ECO banknote entering circulation. But this time, the commitment came from the highest level, from the 69th Ordinary Session of the ECOWAS Heads of State in Lungi, Sierra Leone. The remaining 12 member states reaffirmed their intent, approved a phased rollout, and instructed the Commission to finalize the outstanding issues before December 2026. Then, within days, the first fracture appeared. Not from the 3 Sahel states that had already left ECOWAS, not from external pressure. The first formal refusal came from inside the bloc itself. Guinea, the Republic of Guinea-Conakry, announced it would not adopt the ECO. It would keep the Guinean franc. The question that demands an answer is not simply why one country said no. The question is what Guinea's refusal reveals about the ECO project itself. Whether this currency, after decades of planning, is being designed to serve West African economies or to preserve the architecture of an older monetary system under a new name, and whether the real battle over the ECO is not between ECOWAS and its critics, but between 2 competing visions of what African monetary sovereignty should mean. If you want to understand the forces shaping Africa's political and economic future, subscribe to The Sahel Lens. On the surface, Guinea's decision appears technical. The government spokesperson who confirmed the position after the July summit explained that the country would evaluate the ECO based on its own economic circumstances. The governor of Guinea's central bank, speaking earlier this year during the 66th anniversary of the Guinean franc, described monetary sovereignty as an essential instrument for growth, stability, and managing the revenues from the country's natural resources. The language was careful, diplomatic, even procedural. But the economic logic beneath that language is stark. Guinea's trade patterns do not align with West Africa. According to official trade data, approximately 80% of Guinea's exports go to Asia, not to its ECOWAS neighbors. Guinea is the world's second-largest producer of bauxite, the primary ore for aluminium. More than 70% of that bauxite goes to China. The Simandou iron ore project, one of the largest mining developments on the continent, delivered its first cargoes to China this year. Guinea's economic gravity pulls eastward, not regionally. Inside a monetary union, a country surrenders its exchange rate and its independent monetary policy. It can no longer adjust its currency to respond to trade shocks, commodity price swings, or domestic economic conditions. For a country like Guinea, whose major customers pay in dollars and whose regional trade is minimal, joining a West African currency means accepting monetary rules designed for economies with very different structures. The economist Mohamed Kamara, quoted in reports on the decision, identified a second concern. Guinea fears that entering a monetary union before developing sufficient domestic production capacity could stifle its industrialization. The currency would arrive before the productive base that could benefit from it. So Guinea is not rejecting regional integration, it is questioning the sequencing. Build productive capacity first, then consider monetary union, not the other way around. But Guinea did not simply walk away. At the same summit where the ECO launch was reaffirmed, Guinea requested and was granted admission to the ECOWAS Presidential Task Force on the Single Currency Program. This is the body that will shape the central bank structure, the voting rules, and the list of first participating countries. Before Guinea joined, the only remaining serving member of that task force was President Alassane Ouattara of Côte d'Ivoire. Guinea's strategy is now visible. Keep the national currency, retain monetary control, but take a seat at the table where the rules of the new currency will be written. It is a position of leverage, not retreat. And to understand where that instinct comes from, you have to understand what happened to Guinea almost 70 years ago. In 1958, France, under Charles de Gaulle, organized a constitutional referendum across its African territories. The colonies were offered a choice: join the new French community and retain French support, or vote for immediate independence and face the consequences. Every other territory in French West Africa voted to remain within the French fold. Only Guinea, under Ahmed Sékou Touré, voted no. On October 2, 1958, Guinea became independent. The French response was immediate and brutal. French administrators, teachers, doctors, and engineers were withdrawn. Equipment was dismantled and removed. Historical accounts describe telephone lines being cut, and even light bulbs being taken from public buildings. The message to the rest of Francophone Africa was unmistakable. This is the price of saying no. But Guinea did not collapse. On March 1, 1960, it introduced its own national currency, the Guinean franc. For 66 years, while its Francophone neighbors remained inside a French-guaranteed monetary system, Guinea has operated its own central bank, issued its own currency, and controlled its own monetary policy. The Guinean franc has faced inflation, depreciation, and external shocks. No one claims it has been an unqualified success, but it has been sovereign. Guinean governments, whatever their other failings, could make their own monetary decisions. That memory, that institutional experience, shapes how officials in Conakry view any proposal to surrender monetary control to a regional body whose rules remain unwritten. So when Guinea hesitates today, it is not betraying African unity. It is acting on the lesson that was seared into its national memory in 1958. Read the contract before you sign it. The contract in question has a complicated history. The ECO, as a formal project, dates to the year 2000 in Accra, Ghana. 6 countries, the Gambia, Ghana, Guinea, Liberia, Nigeria, and Sierra Leone, committed to creating a second monetary zone in West Africa. Notice the composition: 5 Anglophone countries plus Guinea, the only Francophone state not using the CFA franc. The plan was called the West African Monetary Zone. Stage 1. The non-CFA countries would create their own common currency. Stage 2. That zone would merge with the existing West African Economic and Monetary Union, the CFA franc bloc, to form a single currency for all of ECOWAS. In June 2019, ECOWAS formally adopted the name ECO and set a 2020 launch date. The framework envisioned a flexible exchange rate regime and a federal model for the future regional central bank. The ECO was intended to be a new currency, not a rebranded CFA franc. Then, in December 2019, something happened that fundamentally altered the trajectory of the project. In Abidjan, President Alassane Ouattara of Côte d'Ivoire stood beside President Emmanuel Macron of France and announced reforms to the CFA franc agreement. The reforms included real changes. The requirement for CFA countries to deposit half of their foreign reserves with the French Treasury would end. The French representative would withdraw from monetary institutions. But the announcement also declared that the reformed CFA franc would take the name ECO, the same name ECOWAS had adopted months earlier for its own independent currency project. And 2 critical pillars remained untouched: the fixed peg to the euro and the French guarantee of unlimited convertibility. In other words, the exchange rate anchor and the external backstop were preserved. The name changed. The deeper architecture did not. The West African Monetary Zone countries responded swiftly. On January 16, 2020, the finance ministers and central bank governors of Nigeria, Ghana, the Gambia, Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea issued a communiqué expressing concern. They stated that the Macron-Ouattara announcement was not in line with the ECOWAS decision to adopt the ECO as an independent single currency. The communiqué was polite but firm. The ECO was supposed to be a break from the CFA franc, not its continuation under new branding. That fundamental disagreement has never been resolved. The exchange rate framework, the governance of the central bank, the location and control of reserves, the voting weights, and the list of first participants remain under negotiation as the December 2026 summit approaches. The same questions that divided the bloc in 2020 are still on the table. What exactly is at stake in those questions can be stated clearly. If the ECO is pegged to the euro, then monetary conditions affecting more than 350 million West Africans will be heavily influenced by decisions made at the European Central Bank in Frankfurt. West African states have no representation on the ECB's governing council. They would not vote on the interest rates that determine borrowing costs for their businesses, the exchange rate that prices their exports, or the inflation target that shapes their cost of living. We have seen this dynamic before, on a different continent. During the Eurozone debt crisis, a single monetary policy had to serve radically unequal economies. It served Germany far more comfortably than it served Greece. The policy rate that was appropriate for Northern European economies was devastatingly tight for Southern European ones. Now imagine that same tension transplanted to West Africa, where the anchor is not even the currency of the strongest member, but the currency of an entirely different continent. A euro-pegged ECO would also link West Africa to European financial infrastructure, at a moment when the global monetary order is fragmenting. The BRICS grouping is expanding and exploring alternatives to dollar dominance. African countries are increasingly conducting trade in local currencies. Guinea itself sends approximately 80% of its exports to Asia, priced in dollars, not euros. A euro peg for a country whose main trading partners are in Asia makes little economic sense. The currency anchor would pull in one direction while trade flows pull in another. And there is a deeper structural concern. The CFA franc system was created by France in December 1945, in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, when European colonial powers still governed most of Africa. It was first pegged to the French franc, and later, in 1999, to the euro. The banknotes are still printed in France. Printing is not the same as control. Many sovereign countries contract foreign printers. But the symbolism matters because of what else remains unresolved. Who authorizes issuance? Who sits on the Monetary Policy Committee, where reserves are held? Who provides the convertibility guarantee, and on what terms? The Macron-Ouattara reforms of 2019 addressed some of these questions, while leaving others deliberately untouched. The guarantee remained. The peg remained. The institutional ties to Paris, while less visible, were not severed. The question West Africans are now asking is whether the ECO will complete the decolonization of the region's monetary architecture or merely modernize it. This is the context in which Guinea's refusal must be understood. Guinea is not the only country raising concerns. The original West African Monetary Zone members have been consistent in their demand for a genuinely independent currency. Nigeria, as the region's largest economy, has particular interests. A currency union that includes Nigeria, alongside much smaller economies, requires careful design. Voting weights, fiscal rules, and shock absorption mechanisms must account for extreme asymmetry. If Nigeria carries the same single vote as every other member, it may resist a system where smaller states can outvote the bloc's economic engine. If voting is weighted by GDP, smaller states may fear domination. Neither model has been agreed. Meanwhile, the political landscape of West Africa has shifted. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger completed their withdrawal from ECOWAS in January 2025 and formed the Alliance of Sahel States. The AES is outside the ECO process entirely. Its leaders have publicly discussed a future common currency of their own. The Confederal Bank for Investment and Development has been announced with initial capital reported at approximately 500 billion CFA francs. The AES states are building parallel institutions, including, potentially, parallel monetary institutions. No new currency has been officially adopted. No launch date has been set. The project remains under discussion, but the trajectory is clear. The AES is not waiting for ECOWAS to resolve its internal monetary debates. So West Africa is now contemplating not one monetary future, but potentially three. The CFA franc zone, which under the Macron-Ouattara reforms may transition to the ECO while retaining the euro peg. The ECOWAS ECO, whose framework remains contested between those who want a clean break from the CFA architecture and those who see continuity as pragmatic, and the nascent AES discussions about a sovereign currency built outside both the CFA system and the ECOWAS framework. Guinea, by staying inside ECOWAS and inside the Presidential Task Force while retaining its own currency, is navigating between these currents. It has not joined the AES. It has not left the ECO negotiation. It has simply refused to commit before the terms are clear. The December 2026 summit is now the decisive moment. The ECOWAS Commission has been instructed to convene the Presidential Task Force before then to resolve the outstanding issues. The questions that must be answered are no longer abstract. What will the ECO be anchored to? Who will control the central bank, and under what voting rules? Where will reserves be held and managed? Who will authorize issuance of the currency? These are not merely technical questions for central bankers. They are questions about who governs the economic lives of more than 350 million people. A single currency for West Africa could be transformative. It could eliminate exchange rate risk for regional trade, reduce transaction costs, deepen integration, and create a monetary zone large enough to matter in global markets. No serious analyst dismisses those potential benefits. But a currency union is not a technical shortcut to integration. It is the deepest form of economic integration, short of political union. It requires aligned fiscal policies, synchronized business cycles, robust shock absorption mechanisms, and a central bank with genuine independence and credibility. The European Union, with vastly greater institutional capacity and decades of preparation, still struggles with the internal contradictions of its monetary union. The idea that West Africa can simply adopt a currency and reap the benefits without first building the institutions and productive capacity to sustain it is a dangerous illusion. The alternative sequencing deserves consideration. Build productive capacity. Integrate infrastructure, energy, and transport networks. Deepen regional supply chains so that countries actually trade with each other. Strengthen domestic financial systems. And only then, once economies are genuinely converging and institutions are credible, introduce a common currency as the capstone of integration, not its foundation. Guinea's position is closer to this logic. Protect the ability to use monetary policy for domestic development while participating in the design of the regional framework. Do not surrender the tool before the structure that would replace it is built. The historical irony is sharp. In 1958, Guinea was isolated for saying no to a French-designed monetary future. Today, it is saying no to a monetary project whose contours are being shaped in part by the same external power that once punished it. And it is saying no not by walking away from the table, but by insisting on sitting at it while keeping its own house in order. For the rest of West Africa, Guinea's decision is an invitation to ask harder questions. Who is writing the rules of the ECO? In whose interest? With what accountability? A currency is not a symbol. It is not a flag. It is a daily reality for every market trader, every importer, every borrower, every saver. If the ECO launches as a genuinely independent African currency, governed by African institutions, and designed around African economic conditions, it will deserve celebration. If it launches as an extension of a colonial-era monetary architecture under a Pan-African name, the beneficiaries will not be the people of the region. They will be the political elites who negotiate it and the external actors who retain influence over its design. Guinea, the country that survived 1958, the country that has carried its own currency for 66 years, has just reminded the entire region of a simple truth. You are allowed to read the contract before you sign it. You are allowed to ask what the ECO will actually be before you agree to replace your national currency with it. And you are allowed to conclude that some contracts, however attractively packaged, do not serve your interests. The months between now and the December 2026 summit will determine whether the ECO becomes a genuine instrument of West African economic sovereignty or the latest chapter in a much older story dressed in new language. The answer will be written not in declarations, but in the details of exchange rate regimes, central bank statutes, and reserve management arrangements that most citizens never read, but that will shape their economic lives for generations. What do you believe the ECO should become? Should it be pegged to the euro, linked to a basket of currencies, backed by African reserves, or allowed to float under an independent African central bank? And do you trust the leaders negotiating this deal to represent your interests? The answer shapes not just a currency, but the economic future of an entire region. If you want to continue following this story as the December summit approaches, subscribe to the Sahel Lens.